Grace had lived most of her life in silence. She was the type of woman people walked past without noticing. She wore plain clothes, patched up again and again because buying new ones was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her shoes were worn thin, her hands roughened from years of scrubbing floors, and her smile was tired but still kind. She worked as a maid in a large mansion owned by one of the city's wealthiest men, a millionaire whose house was filled with luxury cars, sparkling, chandeliers, and priceless paintings. For Grace, every day inside that mansion was a reminder of the distance between her world and theirs. But she never complained. Work was work, and work kept food on the table for her little daughter back home. Each morning, Grace would tie her headscarf, put on her uniform, and remind herself that dignity wasn't about wealth. It was about honesty and effort. She believed in that with her whole heart. One Friday evening, Grace was polishing the marble floor in the living room when she noticed something unusual. The mansion, usually buzzing with laughter and activity, had fallen strangely quiet. The millionaire's young son, Daniel, who often played around noisily, was lying on the couch looking pale. Grace thought at first he was just tired, but then she heard faint groans. His small hands clutched at his chest and his breathing was uneven. Grace froze for a moment, fear crawling up her spine. She called out for anyone in the house, but no one answered. The butler had gone home early, the driver was away for the weekend, and the millionaire himself was still stuck in an important business meeting. Grace knelt beside Daniel, gently shaking him, whispering his name. His eyelids fluttered, his lips looked dry, and a wave of panic hit her. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Her first instinct was to call an ambulance. She grabbed her phone and dialed. The operator explained that it would take at least 40 minutes for an ambulance to reach them, as traffic in the area was unusually heavy, and their location was a bit out of the city center. 40 minutes? Grace's heart sank. She looked down at the boy. He didn't have 40 minutes. Grace felt her knees weaken. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for a miracle. That was when her gaze landed on the set of car keys placed neatly on the polished wooden table. The golden emblem shone under the light, the keys to the millionaire's Lamborghini. She swallowed hard. Her mind spun in circles. That car was more valuable than her entire existence. She had seen it parked in the garage every day, admired, by neighbors and even strangers who passed by. The very thought of touching it was terrifying. The rules of her employment were clear. No maid was ever to sit inside, let alone drive one of the master's cars. Doing so would mean immediate dismissal, perhaps even jail. Grace's hands trembled as she picked up the keys, staring at them as if they carried the weight of the world. She heard the boy's weak groan again, and her heart screamed louder than her fear. She thought of her own daughter at home. What if her little girl were in danger and no one was brave enough to act? Could she live with herself if she let this child suffer because she was too afraid of punishment? In that moment, Grace made the decision. She rushed to the garage, carrying Daniel in her arms. Her breath was uneven, and her heart raced faster. Then her footsteps. The sight of the Lamborghini felt surreal. The bright yellow paint, the low, sleek body, the symbol of power and wealth. It looked more like a piece of art than a vehicle. Grace had never even touched such a car before, but tonight she had no choice. She opened the door with shaky hands and gently laid Daniel on the leather seat. The boy's chest rose and fell weakly, and Grace whispered to him, "Hold on, baby. Please. Just hold on." Sliding into the driver's seat, she felt completely out of place. The seat hugged her body, the steering wheel gleamed, and the dashboard glowed with lights she didn't understand. Her reflection stared back at her. From the shiny interior, an exhausted maid with worn hands sitting in a car worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. She took a deep breath. Grace had never driven anything more than a rusty old hatchback borrowed from her cousin years ago, but she remembered enough to know the basics. She whispered a quick prayer, pressed the start button, and the car roared to life. The sound made her flinch. It was like a wild animal waking up. Her heart pounded, but she didn't let fear win. She pressed her foot down gently, and the car rolled forward. The gates of the mansion opened, and she steered onto the road. At first her movements were stiff, uncertain, But when she saw Daniel's pale face beside her, something inside her shifted. Courage replaced fear. The Lamborghini surged forward with a power she had never imagined. Streetlights blurred, the engine roared, and the wind tore at her uniform as the car cut through the night. Grace's hands gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white, but her eyes stayed locked on the road. She didn't care about the speed. She didn't care about the danger. All she cared about was the boy's faint breaths beside her. Cars honked. As she raced past, people stared. Some even laughed in disbelief at the sight of a maid behind the wheel of a Lamborghini. But Grace ignored them. She pressed harder on the accelerator, whispering to herself, "Just a little more, just a little faster, we'll make it." Inside, her emotions battled fiercely. Fear told her she was breaking the law, risking her job, risking her freedom. But her heart reminded her that life was bigger than rules and fears. A child's life was worth more than any car, more than her own safety. She remembered the long nights she had held her daughter's fevered body, praying for healing. She remembered the desperation of a mother, and she understood the desperation of this moment. The hospital was still miles away, but Grace refused to slow down. Every red light felt like an enemy, every slow driver an obstacle. She weaved through traffic, her lips moving in prayer, her soul begging for strength. She didn't know how long she could keep control of such a powerful machine, but she knew one thing: she could not stop until she got him there. Minutes felt like hours. Her back ached from tension. Her arms shook, but she held on. She glanced at Daniel, who was unconscious now, his head leaning to one side. Her chest tightened in fear, and she pressed the accelerator harder, her eyes burning with tears. Finally, the glowing red sign of the hospital appeared in the distance. Grace let out a sob of relief, but she didn't slow down. She pulled up to the emergency entrance, the tires screeching as she stopped. She flung the door open, scooped Daniel into her arms, and ran inside. Doctors and nurses rushed to them instantly. They took the boy from her arms and wheeled him into the emergency room. Grace collapsed into a chair, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. She had gotten him here in time. But as she sat there, the weight of reality crashed onto her shoulders. She had stolen the Lamborghini. She had broken every rule. She had no idea what the millionaire would say, what punishment awaited her. Her job was gone, her future uncertain. Perhaps even prison awaited. Yet as she wiped her tears, she whispered to herself, "If I had to do it again, I would. A child's life is worth more than fear." And in that quiet hospital waiting room, Grace realized something powerful. Sometimes true courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being terrified and still choosing to act. The hospital. Doors had closed behind Daniel, and Grace sat trembling on the waiting bench. Her hands shook so violently that she had to press them against her knees to steady them. Her uniform, damp with sweat, clung to her back. She wanted to pray, but her mind was too restless to form words. All she could hear was the echo of the Lamborghini's engine roaring in her ears, the sound of her heart pounding as she raced against the clock. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to catch her breath. Then the realization struck her. She had left the Lamborghini parked haphazardly at the emergency entrance. Her eyes widened in panic. That car was not just expensive. It was the crown jewel of the millionaire's collection. A car he had once bragged about being irreplaceable. And now it sat outside with its doors flung open, lights still on, attracting stares from everyone around. Grace stood up quickly, peeking outside the glass doors. Indeed, a small crowd had gathered around the shining yellow machine. Some people were snapping photos with their phones. A security guard had come closer, circling it with suspicion. Grace's stomach twisted. If the police were called, if they discovered she was the one who drove it here, her life could be destroyed in minutes. But then she remembered Daniel. Inside those walls, doctors were fighting to keep him alive. She clenched her fists. Let them take the car. Let them punish her later. What mattered now was the boy. She sat back down, forcing herself to stay put, whispering, "Stay alive, little one. Please stay alive. As she sat waiting, memories floated through her mind. She thought of her own daughter, Amara, who was about the same age as Daniel. Amara loved to draw on scraps of paper, sketching houses with gardens and cars she had never seen up close. Grace remembered one night when Amara had pointed at a picture of a fancy sports car in an old magazine. "Mama, do rich people drive? Like kings?" the girl had asked innocently. Grace had laughed and said, "Maybe they do, but remember this. Kindness makes you greater than any king." Tonight, Grace had driven like no king ever had, out of desperation, out of love. She thought about how, if it were Amara lying unconscious, she would pray that someone, anyone, would be brave enough to act. That thought gave her strength to silence her fears. The waiting room clock ticked slowly, each second like a hammer against her chest. She watched the doors, waiting for news, waiting for a doctor to appear. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, a nurse came out. "Are you with Daniel?" she asked. Grace nodded quickly, standing up, her eyes wide with hope. The nurse smiled faintly. "He's stable for now. You brought him just in time. A few more minutes and things could have been very different." Grace's knees gave out and she sank back onto the chair. Relief washed over her like a wave, leaving her exhausted. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she whispered, "Thank you, God. Thank you." But relief lasted only a moment. A shadow fell across the waiting room entrance. Grace looked up and froze. It was the millionaire. He had finally arrived. He was dressed in his sharp black suit, his tie loosened as if he had rushed from his meeting. His eyes darted to the nurse, then to Grace, and finally to the doors of the emergency ward. His face was unreadable, but Grace felt her stomach twist with dread. She wanted to explain, but her throat closed up. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. He walked past her without a word, straight into the ward where his son lay. Grace clasped her hands together tightly, her heart thundering. She knew what was coming. The shouting, the accusations, maybe even the police. She imagined her daughter crying as her mother was taken away in handcuffs. The thought made her chest ache. Minutes later, he reappeared. His eyes were red, and his usual stern expression had softened into something Grace had never seen before. Fear. For a moment, he looked less like a millionaire and more like a father. He walked toward Grace slowly. She rose to her feet, trembling. "Sir," she began, her voice shaking. I am so sorry. I know I shouldn't have touched your car. I know it was wrong, but he couldn't breathe. The ambulance, 40 minutes. I had no choice. If you want to fire me, if you want to call the police, I understand. But please, don't be angry. I only wanted to save your son." Her words spilled out in a rush, her eyes brimming with tears. She expected anger, maybe even rage. But to her shock, the millionaire didn't raise his voice. Instead, he looked at her in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes wet. He finally whispered, "You drove him here?" Grace nodded quickly, her hands twisting in front of her. "Yes, sir. I drove. I've never driven such a car before. I didn't know if I could handle it. But I couldn't let him." Her voice broke and she couldn't finish the sentence. For a long moment, he just stared at her. The silence felt heavy, like the whole world was holding its breath. Finally, he looked down at his polished shoes, then back at her. His voice was hoarse when he said, "You saved him." Grace blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. The millionaire took a deep breath, his shoulders sinking as though the weight of the world had finally pressed him down. "That car," he continued, his voice steadier now, "is worth millions. But tonight I realized it is worthless compared to my child's life. You did what I could not. You acted when I was absent. You risked everything for him." Grace's lips parted, but no words came out. Her heart pounded with disbelief. She had expected fury, but instead she saw gratitude in his eyes. The millionaire stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Everyone in this city sees me as powerful, but tonight I was powerless. And you, a maid, a woman this world overlooks, showed more courage than I ever have. For that, I will never forget you." Grace's tears flowed freely now. She wanted to collapse, to let the relief wash over her, but she held herself upright. She whispered softly, "I only did what any mother would do." The millionaire gave a small, sad smile. "Yes," he said, "and sometimes mothers are the bravest warriors of all." Behind them, the crowd outside was still murmuring about the Lamborghini, still snapping pictures, still questioning how such a car had ended, up in the hands of a maid. But inside that waiting room, none of it mattered anymore. The sound of the child's steady breathing from the ward was louder than the roar of any engine. Grace realized then that she hadn't just saved Daniel's life. She had touched the heart of a man who thought money was everything. Tonight she had proven that humanity was worth more than wealth. And yet, her journey was not over. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the world outside would see her as a thief or a hero. But for the first time in her life, Grace didn't feel small. She felt strong. Grace barely slept that night. After the doctors assured her that Daniel was out of danger and would need to stay for observation, she sat silently in the hospital corridor, her back pressed against the cold wall. She didn't dare go home. She didn't dare move too far from the ward. Even though the millionaire had spoken words of gratitude, Grace's heart still trembled with fear. She had grown up in a world where poor women like her were never forgiven for breaking the rules of the rich. Gratitude in the heat of the moment could easily turn into anger the next morning. Her thoughts circled endlessly. What if he changes his mind? What if tomorrow, when the fear wears off, he realizes I drove his Lamborghini and calls the police? She pictured officers arriving at her small rented house, her daughter Amara crying as she watched her mother being taken away. The image crushed Grace's heart, but she stayed strong because Daniel's survival gave her some peace. The next morning, sunlight poured through the hospital windows, and the building slowly came alive with noise. Nurses changing shifts, patients being moved, phones ringing at the front desk. Grace sat in her same chair, her uniform wrinkled, her eyes swollen from tears and lack of sleep. She stood up when the doctor finally came to give an update. "Daniel is doing much better," the doctor said kindly. "He'll recover. He'll need rest, but he is safe now." The words lifted Grace's spirit more than she expected. She placed a hand over her chest, whispering a quiet thank you to God. But the relief didn't last long. A sound of footsteps echoed in the hall, firm and deliberate. Grace turned her head and froze. The millionaire was walking toward her, and this time he wasn't alone. Two men in black suits followed him. His personal assistants. Grace's breath caught. Panic rose inside her chest. This is it, she thought. This is when he takes back his words. This is when he shows the world that I am nothing more than a thief who touched what wasn't mine. Grace lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. The millionaire stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable. His assistants hovered nearby, watching her closely as if she were a criminal. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then, to her astonishment, the millionaire dismissed his assistants with a flick of his hand. "Wait outside," he ordered. They obeyed without question, leaving the two of them alone in the hallway. Grace swallowed hard. She forced herself to speak before he could. "Sir, before you say anything, please understand. I didn't mean to disrespect you or your home. I know what I did was wrong. But your son, he couldn't breathe. The ambulance was too far. I couldn't just stand there." Her voice cracked, tears threatening to spill again. "If you want me arrested, I won't fight it. But please remember I only did it for him." She braced herself for anger, but instead, silence filled the air. She risked a glance upward and saw something unexpected. The millionaire's eyes weren't cold. They were heavy, tired, filled with emotions he wasn't used to showing. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "Grace, do you know what people in my world value most?" Grace blinked, unsure how to answer. She shook her head. "Control," he said. "We live to control everything. Our money, our businesses, our families, even our time. But last night, I lost control. I wasn't there when my son needed me. I was sitting in a boardroom fighting for deals while you—" He paused, his lips pressing tightly together, "while you fought for his life." Grace stared at him, stunned. She didn't know how to respond. "You broke every rule," he continued, his tone softening. "But you also reminded me of something I had forgotten. That courage and love can achieve more than money ever could. You risked your life, your job, your future. For a child who isn't even yours, that is something I cannot ignore." Grace's tears spilled then, but they weren't only from fear. They were from the weight of his words, words she had never imagined hearing from a man like him. She whispered, "I only did what I hoped someone would do for my daughter." Millionaire nodded slowly, and for the first time his sharp businessman mask cracked into something almost human. "Your daughter," he repeated. "Yes, now I see." He turned slightly, gesturing for her to follow him. Grace hesitated but obeyed. Together they walked toward the ward. Inside, Daniel lay on the bed, awake now, his small body looking fragile but alive. His cheeks had a hint of color again, and when he saw Grace, his lips curved into the faintest smile. Grace's knees almost gave way. She wanted to run to him, but she held herself back, respecting the millionaire's place as his father. Instead, she stood quietly at the foot of the bed, her hands folded. Daniel's small voice broke the silence. You drove so fast," he whispered, his eyes twinkling with childlike awe. "Faster than Daddy ever does." Grace let out a soft laugh, though tears ran down her face. "I had to, sweetheart. I had to make sure you stayed with us." The boy reached out a weak hand toward her. Grace hesitated, then gently held it, her rough, tired fingers enveloping his small, delicate ones. The sight made the millionaire's eyes glisten with tears he tried to hide. The room was filled with something powerful that morning. Not wealth, not authority, but the simple bond of humanity. Grace had crossed lines she was never supposed to cross, yet in doing so, she had built a bridge of trust and love stronger than anything else. The millionaire stood silently, watching the two of them. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Grace," he said firmly, though his tone carried respect now, not command. "When people outside hear this story, they will talk about the Lamborghini. They'll say you stole it, that you were reckless. But I will make sure they know the truth, that you saved my son." Grace looked at him in shock. "You would do that? Even though it could ruin your reputation?" The millionaire gave a faint smile. "Reputation means nothing if I can't face my own son and say I protected him. You showed me that." For the first time since she had met him, Grace saw not a millionaire, but a father stripped of pride. And in that moment, she realized something incredible. Her act of desperation had not just saved Daniel's life. It had changed his father's heart. Still, Grace knew the world outside might not be so forgiving. The story was already spreading. Strangers snapping photos of her behind the wheel. Whispers about a maid driving a Lamborghini like a racer. She knew she could be mocked, judged, even hated. But looking at Daniel's smile and hearing his faint giggle when he whispered, "Next time, can we go even faster?" Grace knew she would endure any storm, because she had chosen courage over fear, and that choice had saved a life. Grace thought her heart had already gone through every emotion possible: fear, courage, relief, gratitude. But nothing could prepare her for what came next. After Daniel smiled and drifted back into a light sleep, the hospital room grew quiet. Grace stood at the corner, unsure whether she should leave or stay. She still felt like a stranger who had stepped into a world not meant for her. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hands rough, her shoes worn. She didn't belong here among men in suits, nurses in crisp uniforms, and machines worth more than her entire lifetime's earnings. The millionaire sat beside his son's bed, one hand gently resting on Daniel's small arm. He didn't speak for several minutes, just watched his son's chest rise and fall, his eyes watery but fixed. Grace wondered if she should slip away quietly before he remembered what she had done, before gratitude turned to anger. She took a step back, but his voice stopped her. "Don't go," he said quietly, His tone carried no command, no sharpness, just a request. Grace froze. "Sir, She hesitated, then lowered her eyes. "I only stayed to make sure he was safe. Now that he is resting, I should leave. This is your family. I shouldn't be here." He shook his head slowly, his gaze still on his son. "You are part of why he is still breathing. You belong here more than I do right now." The words startled Grace so deeply that she couldn't respond. She simply stood there, clutching her apron, her throat tight. After a long silence, the millionaire finally turned to face her. His eyes, usually sharp and cold, looked different, softer, human. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "Grace, do you know what I thought about last night while I drove here?" Grace shook her head. "I thought about all the times I sat in this mansion surrounded by luxury, telling myself I was a good father because I provided the best of everything. Expensive toys, tutors, clothes, cars. But what good is any of that, when I couldn't even provide what mattered most, being there when he needed me? You, a woman with nothing to your name, gave him something I could not." Grace's lips parted, but she couldn't find her voice. The millionaire stood, walked toward her, and for a moment, Grace thought he might raise his voice, might finally unleash the anger she had been bracing for. Instead, to her shock, he did something unthinkable. He lowered himself onto his knees. Grace gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "Sir, please don't. What are you doing?" The millionaire's voice broke as he spoke. "I am thanking you. People bow to me because of money. But today I bow to you because you saved what money never could, my son's life." Grace's tears spilled instantly. She shook her head, stepping back in disbelief. "No, please." "Sir, stand up. I'm just a maid. I don't deserve this." But he didn't move. He remained kneeling, his voice steady. "You think being a maid makes you less, but last night you proved you are greater than me, greater than my wealth, greater than my pride. You did what no one else dared. You risked everything for a child who wasn't even yours. That is true greatness." Grace's sobs filled the room. She had spent her entire life being invisible, being overlooked. And now, this man who had always walked past her without a glance was kneeling before her. She didn't know how to process it. She dropped to her knees too, shaking her head. "Please don't say that. I only did what any mother would do. I couldn't let him suffer." The millionaire finally stood, helping her up as well. He wiped, his eyes quickly regaining a bit of his composure. But his voice still carried sincerity. "From today, Grace, you are no longer just a maid in my house. You are family." Grace blinked, stunned. "Family? Sir, no, I cannot." "Yes, you can," he interrupted firmly. "You have shown more loyalty than anyone else in my life. You have shown me what real wealth is. My cars, my mansion, my business deals. They are nothing compared to what you have inside you. From today, you will never be treated as less again." Grace's mind spun. Was this truly happening? For years, she had scrubbed floors while being treated like furniture, spoken to harshly, ignored, forgotten. And now the master of the mansion was telling her she was family. "But sir," she whispered, "people will talk. They'll say I stole from you. They'll call me reckless. They'll mock me for driving your car." The millionaire gave a faint smile. "Let them talk. They will talk anyway. But I will make sure they know the truth. I will stand beside you when they ask, and I will say, she is the reason my son is alive." Grace's chest heaved as she cried again, overwhelmed. She thought of her daughter Amara, of the shame she had feared bringing upon her. But now, for the first time, she imagined her daughter holding her head high, proud of her mother's courage. The millionaire placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. "I cannot undo the years of struggle you have faced, but I can promise you this. From today forward, you will never walk alone. You saved my child. Now let me give your child the future she deserves." Grace's knees nearly buckled at his words. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "You would help Amara?" He nodded firmly. "Yes. education, opportunities, a life where she will never feel less. That is the least I can do. Grace wept openly, her whole body shaking. She felt the weight of years of pain, of being unseen, slowly lifting off her shoulders. She realized something powerful. Sometimes an act of courage doesn't just save one life. It changes many lives. Outside the hospital, the world was buzzing with whispers. Pictures of Grace behind the wheel of the Lamborghini had already started, spreading. Some mocked, some laughed, some simply couldn't believe it. But inside that hospital room, a new truth had been written. Grace was no longer just the poor maid who once lived in shadows. She was the woman who had risked everything to save a child. And in the heart of a millionaire, she had become priceless. The sun had just begun to rise when Grace stepped outside the hospital for the first time in 2 days. She stood still, letting the early morning light touch her face. For the first time in a long while, she felt warmth that wasn't just from the sun. It was from hope, the nightmarish fear that had haunted her. Fear of being called a thief, fear of losing her job, fear of her daughter growing up ashamed, was gone. In its place was a strange calm. Grace still wore the same wrinkled maid's uniform, her shoes still scuffed, her hair still tied back simply. But she carried herself differently now. She no longer walked with her head bowed. She no longer felt invisible. She had faced a choice that could have destroyed her life. And instead, it had opened a door she never thought possible. When she returned to the mansion later that week, she expected whispers, maybe even cold stares. After all, the staff had surely heard the rumors, how a maid had stolen the master's Lamborghini and driven it through the city like a racer. Some might envy her, others might mock her. Grace braced herself for it, but what she found shocked her. As she walked through the tall iron gates, she saw the other workers gathered in the courtyard. The gardener, the cook, the cleaners, all stood waiting. Grace felt her stomach twist. This is it, she thought. They're going to shame me. Instead, as she stepped inside, the cook clapped her hands together. The gardener bowed his head. The young cleaners smiled shyly. One by one, they began to applaud. Grace froze, her eyes wide. What are you doing?" she stammered. The cook, an older woman who had always kept her distance, stepped forward. "We heard what you did, Grace. You saved the boy. You had the courage none of us could have shown. We are proud of you." Grace's lips trembled. She had spent years working beside these people, never once feeling noticed. Now they looked at her with respect in their eyes. Tears welled up, and she whispered, "Thank you." Inside the mansion, the millionaire waited for her. He was no longer dressed in sharp business suits. Instead, he wore a simple shirt, his tie missing, his face free of the usual mask of power. He looked more like a father than a businessman. "Now, Grace," he said as she entered, "I've made arrangements." Her heart pounded nervously. "Arrangements, sir?" He nodded. "For you, for your daughter. You will no longer live in that cramped apartment. From today, a home on my estate is yours, a place where you and Amara can live safely. And your daughter? She will go to the best school. Her future will be secure." Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Sir, no, I cannot accept this. I didn't save Daniel for reward. I did it because you have a heart," he finished for her. "And that is exactly why you deserve this. Let me honor your courage, Grace. Let me give back what you gave me, life." Her tears fell freely now. For years she had prayed for a better future for her daughter, prayed silently while scrubbing floors, prayed while walking home with aching feet. And now, those prayers were being answered in a way she could never have imagined. The days that followed were unlike anything Grace had ever experienced. She moved into a modest but beautiful cottage on the estate grounds. For the first time, she had her own garden, her own clean kitchen, her own space where her daughter could play without fear of broken walls or leaking roofs. Amara's eyes had lit up the day she saw it. "Mama, is this really ours?" she had asked, running through the rooms with laughter. Grace had nodded, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "Yes, baby. It's ours. God has given us a new beginning." The millionaire kept his word. Amara was enrolled in a private school. She was given books, uniforms, and opportunities Grace had never dreamed of affording. And though Grace worried that Amara might feel out of place among wealthy children, the little girl surprised her. When asked about her mother, Amara stood proudly and said, "My mama is a hero. She saved a boy's life." The words spread like wildfire. What began as whispers about a maid stealing a Lamborghini soon turned into admiration. Newspapers picked up the story, calling it the ride of courage. Journalists came knocking, but Grace stayed humble, refusing to take the spotlight. Still, the truth could not be hidden. The millionaire himself gave a statement. "Yes, she drove my Lamborghini. Yes, she broke rules. But she saved my son's life. And for that, she is not a thief. She is family." The city was stunned. People who had once looked down on Grace now spoke of her with respect. Some criticized, some doubted, but the majority admired her bravery. And Grace, though overwhelmed by the attention, held on to one simple truth. She hadn't done it for fame, or reward, or respect. She had done it for love. Months passed. Daniel grew stronger. He often visited Grace's cottage, playing with Amara in the garden. The children laughed together, and their bond grew as if they had been siblings all along. Grace watched them with a full heart. She had once feared Daniel's father would hate her forever for touching his car. Instead, he had opened his heart to her family. One evening, as Grace watered the small flowers outside her cottage, the millionaire walked up quietly. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "You know, Grace," he said softly, "I used to believe wealth was measured by the cars we drive, the houses we own, the businesses we control. But you taught me something. Wealth is measured by the lives we touch, the love we give, and the courage we show." Grace looked at him, her eyes shining. "I didn't mean to teach you anything, sir. I just followed my heart." "And that," he said with a faint smile, "is the greatest lesson of all." Grace turned her eyes back to the garden, her soul full. She thought of the journey she had taken, from being invisible, a poor maid scrubbing floors, to standing proud as someone who had changed lives with one act of courage. She thought of the night she had pressed her trembling foot on the accelerator of a Lamborghini, not for thrill, not for pride, but to save a life. That night had rewritten her story forever. Her daughter would grow up proud. Her heart would never again carry the weight of invisibility. And though the world would forever remember her as the maid who drove the Lamborghini, Grace knew the truth. She was the mother who chose courage. And in that choice, she had found not just a new beginning, but a new life.